Thanks for dropping in. Yeah, we're going to read Capitalist Realism. Well, not the whole thing. It's not very long. It's 88 pages in this extremely legal PDF. I don't know. No worries. Yeah, that's a pretty reasonable excuse. Not that you need one, of course, but yeah. You should check this out, though. It's great. It's a piece of contemporary political philosophy. Mark Fisher was a British academic. Yeah, at an English university. I can't remember which one, but he was part of the CCRU, which was like the origin of modern accelerationism. What's his name? Nick Land was there? Nick Lane? I mixed them up. One of them's a cool biologist, and one of them's an uncool fascist slash drum and bass enthusiast. But yeah, he worked with Mark Fisher and a bunch of other people. I think also the what's called xenofeminism came out of the CCRU. Yeah, they're kind of like post-leftists. Have you read this before, Isabel? I assume you've had at least a bit of contact with Mark Fisher. But yeah, he was like big in the meme scene 2 years ago or something. Maybe a bit more. But yeah, no longer. Nah. Yeah, it's pretty good. As you said before, you'll probably get more of the references, but he does make a bunch of fucking obscure references that I've got no clue what he's talking about. I think it even starts like that. Yes, he's a writer, theorist, and teacher. He was. Rest in peace, Mark Fishy. Yeah, he killed himself, which is sad. Yeah. So, yeah, these are the chapters. We'll probably just do chapter 1, I reckon. Chapter 2's 4 pages, so that might be, like, doable. Ooh, Capitalism and the Real. I haven't revisited this since... Oh, sorry, that's Bagel. Being a good boy and chewing a bone. So, excuse the crunching. The banging and crashing. Just do that just over here, mister. Yeah, perfect. We'll see how that goes. Just a problem with it. My new floor. Yeah, the real is like, I assume he's using the like Lacanian sense, but anyway. Let us begin. Also, hey, Solidarity, what up? Thanks for coming along. So, Capitalist Realism, Chapter 1. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It's a famous quote. I assume he's going to go into the origins of it, but widely misattributed. I can't actually remember who said it first. I think it was Jameson. Anyway. So, in one of the key scenes in Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 film Children of Men, Clive Owen's character Theo visits a friend at Battersea Power Station, which is now some combination of government building and private collection. Whoops. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think it was Plato who said that, actually. Some combination of government building and private collection. Cultural treasures, Michelangelo's David, Picasso's Guernica, Pink Floyd's Inflatable Pig, are preserved in a building that is itself a refurbished heritage artifact. This is our only glimpse into the lives of the elite holed up against the effects of a catastrophe which has caused mass sterility. No children have been born for a generation. Theo asks the question, how all this can matter if there will be no one to see it? The alibi can no longer be future generations, since there will be none. The response is nihilistic hedonism. I try not to think about it. What is unique about the dystopia in Children of Men, I haven't seen it, by the way, is that it is specific to late capitalism. This isn't the familiar totalitarian scenario routinely trotted out in cinematic dystopias. See, for example, James McTague's 2005 V for Vendetta. That one I have seen. In the P.D. James novel on which the film is based, democracy is suspended, but the country is ruled over by a self-appointed warden. But, wisely, the film downplays all of this. For all that we know, the authoritarian measures that are everywhere in place could have been implemented within a political structure that remains notionally democratic. The war on terror has prepared us for such a development. The normalization of crisis produces a situation in which the repealing of measures brought in to deal with an emergency becomes unimaginable. When will the war be over? It is super silly. I believe it had the highest body count in cinema for a long time, Equilibrium. I don't know if it still does, but that's why I watched it in high school. But I love that at the end, that spoilers, katanas off a guy's face, and it's just like they drop like an A4 piece of paper with a picture of his face printed on it on the ground. It's like, oh my god, special effects. They spent all of their money on the hordes of dead guys. Watching Children of Men, we're inevitably reminded of the phrase, attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Wee wee. I didn't even say it. I slept. Zedge. Come on. That it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That slogan captures precisely what I mean by capitalist realism. The widespread sense that not only is capitalism... Is the chat box not showing up? No, it's not, because I'm a doofus. Boo, that's annoying. Alright. Everyone just have that entire conversation again, just right now, so everyone on YouTube can see. Alright, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. First, solidarity. Nice. We make that bigger for everybody. Yeah. Except I've arranged this terribly. Doesn't matter. I'm a pro streamer, everybody. Once dystopian films and novels were exercises in such acts of imagination, the disasters they depicted acting as narrative pretext for the emergence of different ways of living. Not so in Children of Men. The world that it projects seems more like an extrapolation or exacerbation of ours than an alternative to it. In its world, as in ours, ultra-authoritarianism and capital are by no means incompatible. Internment camps and franchise coffee bars coexist. In Children of Men, public space is abandoned, given over to the uncollected garbage and stalking animals. One especially resonant scene takes place inside a derelict school through which a deer runs. Neoliberals, the capitalist realists par excellence, have celebrated the destruction of public space, but contrary to their official hopes, there is no withering away of the state in Children of Men, only a stripping back of the state to its core military and police functions. I say official hopes, since neoliberalism surreptitiously relied on the state even while it has ideologically excoriated it. This was made spectacularly clear during the banking crisis of 2008, when, at the invitation of neoliberal ideologues, the state rushed in to shore up the banking system. It's interesting reading this in like a post-corona world or whatever, where the banking crisis and neoliberalism are no longer like the determining like factors of our political space. Like, say what you will about Morrison and Turnbull, they were not nearly as like neoliberal as Tony Abbott was. And like, I'd say the same was true for Trump even, though he's kind of an outlier in other ways, so I'm not sure we should count it. Imagining photos of Paris of garbage piled up everywhere. Yeah. Anyway, he's going to talk about neoliberalism a lot. Oh, I know I should put this over. I should put this over on this side. I'm terrible. Because of strikes, yeah. Nah. We're all just going to have to suffer with not being able to read. Next stream I'll try and change the font color. Anyway. The catastrophe in Children of Men is neither waiting neoliberalism, not my favorite neo, or my favorite liberalism. I would agree on both counts. The catastrophe in Children of Men is neither waiting down the road nor has it already happened. Rather, it is being lived through. There's no punctual moment of disaster. The world doesn't end with a bang. It winks out, unravels, gradually falls apart. What caused the catastrophe to occur? Who knows? Its cause lies long in the past, so absolutely detached from the present as to seem like the caprice of a malign being. Caprice? I understood everything except capiche. A negative miracle, a malediction which no penitence can ameliorate. Sometimes flowery language in philosophy is like really annoying, and I'm not saying Mark Fisher is never annoying, but he just has a nice turn of phrase, doesn't he? Such a blight can only be eased by an intervention that can no more be anticipated than was the onset of the curse in the first place. Action is pointless. Only senseless hope makes sense. Superstition and religion, the first resorts of the helpless, proliferate. It's like that saying from some famous anarchist, I can't remember which one, Proudhon, maybe? But it's something like a poor man has 3 choices: liquor, the church, or revolution, or something. Yeah, I believe it was Plato. Yeah, exactly. But what of the catastrophe itself? It is evident the theme of sterility must be read metaphorically as the displacement of another kind of anxiety. Interesting. Again, haven't seen the film, so not super insightful. Yeah, the slaps. Yeah, absolutely. It do. I want to argue this anxiety cries out to be read in cultural terms. That the question of the film poses is how long can a culture persist without the new? What happens if the young are no longer capable of producing surprises? Children of Men connects with the suspicion that the end has already come, the thought that it could well be the case that the future harbours only reiteration and repermutation. Could it be that there are no breaks, no shocks of the new to come? Such anxieties tend to result in a bipolar oscillation. The weak messianic hope that there must be something new on the way lapses into the morose conviction that nothing new can ever happen. #relatable. The focus shifts from the next big thing to the last big thing. No caps. How long ago did it happen, and just how big was it? That's funny, given my remark about the global financial crisis, when now we've had like the coronavirus, and it's completely sort of replaced the GFC. Though, of course, what with the bank collapses happening now, it's making a comeback. T.S. Eliot looms in the background of Children of Men, which, after all, inherits the theme of sterility from The Wasteland. Boo, T.S. Eliot. The Thing About Cats was his only good poem. The film's closing epigraph, Shanti Shanti Shanti, has more to do with Eliot's fragmentary pieces than the Upanishad's piece. Perhaps it is possible to see that the concerns of another Eliot, the Eliot of tradition and the individual talent, whereas the Eliot of the cat name thing, ciphered in Children of Men. It was in this essay that Eliot, the anticipation of Harold Bloom, described the reciprocal relationship between the canonical and the new. The new defines itself in response to what is already established. At the same time, the established has to reconfigure itself in response to the new. Eliot's claim was that the exhaustion of the future does not even leave us with the past. Wow. Another good sentence there. Yeah, rocks hard. Tradition counts for nothing when it's no longer contested and modified. A culture that is merely preserved is no culture at all. The fate of Picasso's Guernica in the film, once a howl of anguish and outrage against fascist atrocities, now a wall hanging, is exemplary. Like its Battersea hanging space in the film, the painting is accorded iconic status only when it's deprived of any possible function or context. No cultural object can retain its power when there were no longer new eyes to see it. We do not need to wait for Children of Men's near future to arrive to see this transformation. Oh yeah, please go on. I don't feel strongly about it not being a weird take, but I don't know, kind of checks out to me. But of course, you know more about Guernica than I do. We do not need to wait for Children of Men's near future to arrive to see this transformation of culture into museum pieces. The power of capitalist realism derives in part from the way that capitalism subsumes and consumes all of previous history. One effect of its system of equivalence, which can assign all cultural objects, whether they're religious iconography, pornography, or das Kapital, a monetary value. Walk around the British Museum, where you see objects torn from their life worlds and assembled as if on the deck of some predator spacecraft, and you have a powerful image of this process at work. In the conversion of practices and rituals into merely aesthetic objects, the beliefs of previous cultures are objectively ionized. Ionized? Maybe it's just a movie thing. It has iconic status when considered in context too, which it currently / still is. Yeah, I see your point. Saying like, well, I mean, he's saying that that's already happened to an extent, right? Like that when we put things in museums, we're already doing the thing that is like extended the like end point in Children of Men. But yeah, like yeah. The beliefs of previous cultures are objectively ionized, transformed into artifacts. I've never encountered that word before, it's a weird one. Capitalist realism is therefore not a particular type of realism. It's more like realism in itself. Okay, that's a very Hegelian remark. Zizek. Now you can do the alarm, solidarity. Zizek says that the Hegelian structure is a genus that is also a species of that genus. Thank you. Woo. Yeah. So capitalist realism is therefore not a particular type of realism. It's more like I think we get to Alien in this book at some point. Capitalist realism is not a particular type of realism. It's more like realism in itself. So that's, that's like it's a member of its own genus. Even though there are other types of realism, capitalist realism is like the real realism or something. As Marx and Engels themselves observed in the Communist Manifesto, capital has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, in this case probably meaning like entheosism, the Greek sense of like, or like entheogens, of like chivalrous rapture of God, or whatever, of Philistine sentimentalism, of the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom: free trade. Crowd boos. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Yeah, I think, again, they might say something like, capital... there's this idea capital has been lurking in the background of previous human societies, but only in capitalism does it, like, appear as itself. And that's kind of the same thing about, like, realism appears as itself, or something. Capitalism is what is left when beliefs have collapsed at the level of ritual or symbolic elaboration. So one of the things that I really enjoy, but is also frustrating about reading Zizek, is that he never says what his point is or what he wants from people. He just says a bunch of stuff, and he, like, points out these, like, little conceptual patterns. And so that's why, that's, my housemate said my catchphrase is, Lacan was right, hits bong. Well, no, so some philosophers, like, a lot of philosophers are like, you should do this or that. Like Immanuel Kant, for example. He's like, this is how the world is. This is how we should act. Do it. Whereas Zizek is like, isn't it interesting when a thing is a part of another thing that is also that thing? And so I just, like, go around the world and, like, something happens and I'm like, it's like that thing Zizek always talks about. But, like, I don't have any other conclusion other than, like, it's this, like, little conceptual shape thing. It's like, that's cool, but, like, so what? So what? I bring it up when I'm reading other things. Capitalism is what is left when beliefs have collapsed at the level of ritual or symbolic elaboration, and all that is left is the consumer spectator trudging through the ruins and the relics. This is another very, like, Lacano-Hegelian thing, ritual or symbolic elaboration. Though I'm not sure that's entirely true. Like, I think capitalism involves a whole lot of symbolic elaboration. I'm not sure what he means by that exactly, but I think I might mildly disagree. Yet this turn from belief to aesthetics, from engagement to spectatorship, is held to be one of the virtues of capitalist realism, in claiming, as Badiou puts it, to have delivered from us the fatal abstractions inspired by the ideologies of the past. Capitalist realism presents itself as a shield protecting us from the perils posed by belief itself. The attitude of ironic distance proper to postmodern capitalism is supposed to immunize us against the seductions of fanaticism. Lowering our expectations, we're told, is a small price to pay for being protected from terror and totalitarianism. We live in a contradiction, Badiou has observed. So, the attitude of ironic distance proper to postmodern capitalism is supposed to immunize us against the seductions of fanaticism. Interesting, I feel like this ties in with something I was talking to my therapist about this week. I might take note of this and come back to it later. Page 11 in this PDF. Alright, we live in a contradiction, Badiou has observed, a brutal state of affairs profoundly inegalitarian, where all existence is evaluated in terms of money alone, is presented to us as ideal. To justify their conservatism, the partisans of that established order cannot really call it ideal or wonderful. So instead they've decided to say that all the rest is horrible. Okay. Sure, they say, we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky that we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy's not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic, don't we? We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut their throats with machetes like they do in Rwanda, and so on. The realism here is analogous to the deflationary perspective of a depressive who believes that any positive state, any hope, is a dangerous illusion. Ouch, call me out harder, Mark, why don't you? Yeah, that's the other thing about reading Mark Fisher, is that he's, like, deeply depressed and is going to kill himself soon. I mean, I think it's like 3 or 4 years after Capitalist Realism is published. And he talks a lot about mental illness, which I think is mostly in the back half of this book. But yeah, he's calling himself out, absolutely, absolutely. But also all of his friends and students and mentors and everyone else. But I guess that's kind of how it works, right? Like, yeah, I emailed my psych the other day because I was like thinking about someone. I saw a Nestle ad, and I was like kind of shocked by it on some level, and I thought to myself, I bet the people who wrote and produced and made this ad are really like unhappy. And it just kind of like relaxed me and was like a comforting thought. Anyway, in their account of capitalism, surely the most impressive since Marx's, Deleuze and Guattari describe capitalism as a kind of dark potentiality which haunted all previous social systems. Capital, they argue, is the unnameable thing, the abomination which primitive and feudal societies warded off in advance. When it actually arrives, capitalism brings with it a massive desacralization of culture. It's a system which is no longer governed by any transcendent law. On the contrary, it dismantles all such codes, only to reinstall them on an ad hoc basis. The limits of capitalism are not fixed by fiat, but defined and redefined pragmatically and improvisationally. Or one might say, they territorialized and re-territorialized pragmatically and improvisationally. This makes capitalism very much like The Thing in John Carpenter's film of the same name. Now, this one I've seen. A monstrous, infinitely plastic entity capable of metabolizing and absorbing anything which comes into contact with it, with which it comes into contact. Capital, Deleuze and Guattari say, is a motley painting of everything that ever was, a strange hybrid of the ultra-modern and the archaic. In the years since Deleuze and Guattari wrote the 2 volumes of their Capitalism and Schizophrenia, it seemed as if the deterritorializing impulses of capitalism have been confined to finance, leaving culture presided over by the forces of re-territorialization. Yeah. Sorry, he's already doing it. That's interesting. I mean, I haven't been alive, or I wasn't alive for most of that, so I can't comment, but that seems kind of unlikely to me. This malaise, this feeling that there's nothing new, is itself nothing new, of course. We find ourselves at the notorious end of history trumpeted by Francis Fukuyama after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Fukuyama's thesis that history has climaxed with liberal capitalism may have been widely derided, but it's accepted, even assumed, at the level of the cultural unconscious. I would agree with that. It should be remembered, though, that even when Fukuyama advanced it, the idea that history had reached a terminal breach was not merely triumphalist. Fukuyama warned that his radiant city would be haunted, but he thought that its specters would be Nietzschean rather than Marxian. Again, even when he's being really pretentious, it just, and like, big brain philosophy boy, just sounds nice coming off the tip of the tongue. Some of Nietzsche's most prescient pages are those in which he describes the oversaturation of an age with history. Cool. I've read almost zero Nietzsche, which is, poor form for an emo philosophy major. It leads an age into a dangerous mood of irony in regards to itself, he wrote in Untimely Meditations, and subsequently into the even more dangerous mood of cynicism, in which cosmopolitan fingering, a detached spectatorialism, replaces engagement and involvement. Yeah, amen. This is the condition of Nietzsche's last man, who has seen everything but is decadently enfeebled precisely by this excess of self-awareness. What up, Plains? You gave it a go when you were a teenager? Yeah, I read Metamorphosis and Sartre when I was a teen. That was my edgy philosophy. I didn't get much out of it other than a love and awareness of the picture they used for the cover, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. Cool, let me look it up. Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. Ooh, beautiful. No. Fukuyama's position is in some ways a mirror image of Frederick Jameson's. Jameson famously claimed that postmodernism is the cultural logic of late capitalism. He argued that the failure of the future was constitutive of postmodern cultural scene, which, as he correctly prophesied, would become dominated by pastiche and revivalism. Given that Jameson has made a convincing case for the relationship between postmodern culture and certain tendencies in consumer or post-Fordist capitalism, it could appear that there is no need for the concept of capitalist realism at all. In some ways this is true. What I'm calling capitalist realism can be subsumed under the rubric of postmodernism as theorized by Jameson. Yet, despite Jameson's heroic work of clarification, postmodernism remains a hugely contested term, its meanings, appropriately but unhelpfully, unsettled and multiple. More importantly, I would want to argue that some of the processes which Jameson described and analysed have now become so aggravated and chronic that they've gone through a change in kind. One day I will understand the link between philosophy and political theory. Did not expect to see Fukuyama here. I mean, we're reading a book called Capitalist Realism. It's pretty on the nose. Yeah, I mean, they're just very closely related. I think we get the word politics from Plato when he says man is a political animal. Welcome, by the way. Plato's, yeah, I don't know if that's actually the origin of the word politics, but, yeah. He says man is a political animal, though he means political theory is just philosophy that pretends it's non-ideological. Yeah. Or sometimes is more explicitly ideological. Yeah, totally. Solidarity. Yeah, change in kind. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Ultimately, there are three reasons that I prefer the term capitalist realism to postmodernism. In the 1980s, when Jameson first advanced his thesis about postmodernism, there were still, in name at least, political alternatives to capitalism, i.e. the Soviets and Communist China. Maybe less so China at this time, but anyway. What we are dealing with now, however, is a deeper, far more pervasive sense of exhaustion, of cultural and political sterility. In the 80s, really existing socialism still persisted. It's funny, now it's actually existing socialism. Still persisted, albeit in its final phase of collapse. In Britain, the fault lines of class antagonism were fully exposed in an event like the miners' strike of 84-85, and the defeat of the miners was an important moment in the development of capitalist realism, at least as significant in its symbolic dimension as in its practical effects. The closure of pits was defended precisely on the grounds that keeping them open was not economically realistic, and the miners were cast in the role of the last actors in a doomed proletarian romance. Again, just keep going, Mark. I love it. The 80s were the period when capitalist realism was fought for and established, when Margaret Thatcher's doctrine was, "there is no alternative," as succinct a slogan of capitalist realism as you could hope for, become a brutally self-fulfilling prophecy. Secondly, postmodernism involved some relationship to modernism. Jameson's work on postmodernism began with an interrogation of the idea, cherished by the likes of Adorno, that modernism possessed revolutionary potentials by virtue of its formal innovations alone. What Jameson saw happening instead was the incorporation of modernist motifs into popular culture. Suddenly, for example, surrealist techniques would appear in advertising. At the same time as particular modernist forms were absorbed and commodified, modernism's credos, its supposed belief in elitism, and its monological top-down model of culture, were challenged and rejected in the name of difference, diversity, and multiplicity. Modernism's credos, its supposed belief, and its monological top-down model of culture. Interesting. Huh. I hate that I think that's cool. T-academic. They got me. Now I'm gonna invest in Chupa Chup. Capitalist realism no longer stages this kind of confrontation with modernism. On the contrary, it takes the vanquishing of modernism for granted. Modernism is now something that can periodically return, but only as a frozen aesthetic style, never as an ideal for living. Thirdly, a whole generation has passed since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Yeah, that's right. Breaking news at 12. It did an ad for a chocolate company, which is incredible. Oh, hell yeah. Remind me about it at the end of the chapter, which I think is soon. In the 1960s and 70s, capitalism had to face the problem of how to contain and absorb energies from outside. It now, in fact, has the opposite problem, having all too successfully incorporated externality. How can it function without an outside it can colonize and appropriate? For most people under 20 in Europe and North America, the lack of alternatives to capitalism is no longer even an issue. I think that's probably less true now than when he was writing. I saw a K-pop star who did not know what the Berlin Wall was the other day, and I had to go do breathing exercises. Hey, you know. I don't know when I learnt about it. um, Capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable. Dali had already produced all his best work by 1969 when the Chop Chop thing happened. Jameson used to report in horror about the ways that capitalism has seeped into the very unconscious. Now, the fact that capitalism had colonized the dreaming life of the population is so taken for granted that it's no longer worthy of comment. It would be dangerous and misleading to imagine the near past was some prelapsarian state, as in before a fall, like the fall in Eden, state rife with political potentials, so it's as well to remember the role that commodification played in the production of culture throughout the 20th century. Yet the old struggle between détournement and recuperation... Do you know what that is? I didn't need to copy-paste it if I just... The practice which opposes spectacle by refusing all forms of private property in the production of cultural work. Okay, cool. Rerouting, hijacking in French. The integration of present or past artistic productions into a superior construction of a milieu. Alright, whatever. Walk that lobster. Cool. Yeah. Between subversion and incorporation, also, Discordianism, I reckon. Between subversion and incorporation seems to have been played out. What we're dealing with now is not the incorporation of materials that previously seemed to possess subversive potentials, but instead, their pre-corporation, the preemptive formatting and shaping of desires, aspirations, and hopes by capitalist culture. Sure, I mean, that's a pretty, in some ways, like, entry-level Marxist cultural take or whatever, but it's not wrong. Like, no one wants Coke until they see Coke or taste Coke for the first time or whatever. Like, you get trained to want things that are available on the market. But surely that also happened in pre-capitalist eras, right? Like, no one wanted televisions. They all wanted, purple clothes or whatever. I don't. You get what I'm saying? Witness, for example, the establishment of settled alternative or independent cultural zones, which endlessly repeat older gestures of rebellion and contestation as if for the first time. Yeah, like a graffiti wall near my parents' place. Talking more ideologically than materially. Yeah, that makes sense. The purple robes were expensive and aspirational because they had expensive dye and they were just like had a high production value or whatever, whereas Nike Airs don't cost any more than whatever other shoe to make. Yeah. Alternative and independent don't designate something outside mainstream culture. Rather, they are styles. In fact, the dominant styles within the mainstream. No one embodied and struggled with this deadlock more than Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. Yeah, right. Your production of identity through purchase of commodities. Yeah. That makes sense to me. Good call, T academic. I like that. In this dreadful lassitude and objectless rage, Cobain seemed to give wearied voice to the despondency of the generation that had come after history, whose every move was anticipated, tracked, bought, and sold before it had even happened. Cobain knew that he was just another piece of spectacle, that nothing runs on better than MTV than a protest against MTV. I feel like I'm reading an obituary. Knew that his every move was a cliche, two obituaries, was a cliche scripted in advance, knew that even realizing it is a cliche. The impasse that paralyzed Cobain is precisely the one that Jameson described. Like postmodern culture in general, Cobain found himself in a world in which stylistic innovation is no longer possible, where all that's left is to imitate dead styles, to speak through the masks and with the voices of the styles in the imaginary museum. Here, even success meant failure, since to succeed would only mean that you were the new meat on which the system could feed. Best-selling theory book, Capitalist Realism. But the high existential angst of Nirvana and Cobain belongs to an older moment. What succeeded them was a pastiche rock, which reproduced the forms of the past without anxiety. Cobain's death confirmed the defeat and incorporation of rock's utopian and Promethean ambitions. Just such a good writer. When he died, rock was already being eclipsed by hip-hop, whose global success has presupposed just the kind of pre-corporation by capital which I alluded to above. For much hip-hop, any naive hope that youth culture could change anything has been replaced by the hard-headed embracing of a brutally reductive version of reality. Bro, when did Dead Prez write all of their songs? Formed in 96. Yeah, what the hell are you talking about? In hip hop, Simon Reynolds points out in a 1996 essay in the Wire magazine, real has two meanings. First, it means authentic, uncompromised music that refuses to sell out to the music industry and softens its message for crossover. Real also signifies that the music reflects a reality constituted by late capitalist economic instability, institutionalized racism, and increased surveillance and harassment of youth by the police. Real means the death of the social. It means corporations who respond to increased profits not by raising pay or improving benefits, but by downsizing. Look, that is in general a fair point, but I'd say with Mark Fisher in particular, he was likely to be more familiar. He was like a DJ. I don't know. Do you know the famous story about Nick Lane, who was Mark Fisher's protege or like a colleague at the CCRU, who took a lot of amphetamines and listened to a lot of jungle music, and wrote Fanged Numina, which I've never even tried to read, and I would probably recommend staying the heck away from him. It would be Pog, yeah. Yeah, totally. And like I can think of like a couple of those bands, but for the most part, this is a completely reasonable point. Like, yeah. Wu-Tang are a good example, I would say, for the most part. But Nick Lane was giving a lecture at some, I don't know, about the future of Marxism or something. I can't remember what it was. And it was like 8 a.m, and he just blasted jungle music and like lay on the ground with the microphone kind of like, and one of the students got up and said, "Some of us are still Marxists, you know," and walked out. And it was like a whole thing. I love it because it's in some ways a really good shorthand for thinking about what materialism is. Yeah. But it's also just like, I don't know, everyone sucks in that story. But not by raising pay or improving benefits, but by downsizing, the laying off of the permanent workforce in order to create a floating employment pool of part-time and freelance workers without benefits or job security. Yeah, exactly. In the end, it was precisely hip-hop's performance of this first version of the real, the uncompromising, that enabled its easy absorption... Yeah. The easy absorption into the second, the reality of late capitalist economic instability, where such authenticity has proven highly marketable. Gangster rap neither merely reflects pre-existing social conditions, as many of its advocates claim, nor does it simply cause those conditions, as its critics argue. Rather, the circuit whereby hip-hop and the late capitalist social field feed each other is one by the means of which capitalist realism transforms itself into a kind of anti-mythical myth. The affinity between hip-hop and gangster movies such as Scarface, the Godfather films, Reservoir Dogs, Goodfellas, and Pulp Fiction... Okay. But what about, like, kung fu movies? Arises from the common claim to have stripped the world of sentimental illusions and seen it for what it really is. A Hobbesian war of all against all. A system of perpetual exploitation and generalized criminality. In hip-hop, Reynolds writes, to get real... Yeah, classic example. I haven't seen that for forever. I watched Lock, Stock a little while ago, yeah. To get real is to confront a state of nature where dog eats dog, where you're either a winner or a loser, and where most will be losers. The same neo-noir worldview can be found in the comic books of Frank Miller and in the novels of James Ellroy. There is a kind of machismo or demythologization in Miller and Ellroy's works. It's true about Miller. I think I've read Sin City ages ago. They pose as unflinching observers who refuse to prettify the world so that it can be fitted into the supposedly simple ethical binaries of the superhero comic and the traditional crime novel. Who's his character? Like, I don't know, James Ellroy. The pose as unflinching observer... Sorry, you did that. The realism here is somehow underscored rather than undercut by their fixation on the luridly venal. Luridly venal. That's a good name for a band. Luridly venal. Even though the hyperbolic insistence on cruelty, betrayal, and savagery in both writers quickly becomes pantomimic. In his Pitch Blackness, Mike Davis wrote of Elroy in 1992, "There is no light left to cast shadows, and evil becomes a forensic banality." The result feels very much like the actual moral texture of the Reagan-Bush era. He wrote LA Confidential. Okay, sure. Other noir stuff that got turned into movies. A supersaturation of corruption that fails any longer to outrage or even interest. Yet this very desensitization serves a function for capitalist realism. Davis hypothesized that the role of LA noir may have been to endorse the emergence of Homo Reaganus. Interesting. That's a tasty morsel on which to end the chapter. How's everyone going? I think there's some Zizek in this chapter as well. It's only a couple of pages. Would everyone be keen? We've been going about 45 minutes. So I reckon we'll go pretty much bang on an hour if we do another chapter. I might just disappear real quick. Yeah, Dali ad. Dali in some commercials. Lanvin Chocolate. They're all very short. Oh, Iron Chef. Yeah, cool. That's a great call. Alright, I'll be back in a sec.
Je suis fou du chocolat Lanvin.
First, it dissolves. Happy bubbles, but devoted bubbles.
Then the Alka-Seltzer shoots into the stomach. Here, it neutralizes that bad excess acid. Meantime, the special ibuprofen is speeding into your bloodstream to all places of pain. So those beautiful places will feel beautiful again. Alka-Seltzer is a work of art, truly one of a kind, like Dalí.
En esta tierra hay eso. Un veterano sabor. Veterano tiene eso.
Kawani Jolifanto Blumba Ofali Hambla. Grossigama Pafla Habla Hormigaga Gorman. High Globlo Ikora Sula Huju. Holaka Holala. And Logobang, Blagobang Baso Futaka. Ooh.
And now let's meet our first contestant. Will you come in and sign in, please?
I thought that was still that first 90-second video or whatever, but whoops, where are we going? This one. Okay. Capitalist Realism, Chapter 2. What if you held a protest and everybody came? Everyone came, sorry. In the case of gangster rap and Elroy, capitalist realism takes the form of a kind of super-identification with capital at its most pitilessly predatory. But this need not be the case. In fact, capitalist realism is very far from precluding a certain anti-capitalism. After all, and as Zizek has provocatively pointed out, anti-capitalism is widely disseminated in capitalism. Time after time, the villain in Hollywood films will turn out to be the evil corporation. Far from undermining capitalist realism, this gestural anti-capitalism actually reinforces it. Take Disney Pixar's WALL-E 2008. It's funny, with Zizek, one has to assume he hasn't read or seen anything that he mentions, but with Mark Fisher, I assume that he has. The film shows an Earth so despoiled that human beings are no longer capable of inhabiting it. We're left in no doubt that consumer capitalism and corporations, or rather one megacorporation, by and large, is responsible for this depredation. And when we eventually see the human beings in off-world exile, they are infantile and obese, interacting via screen interfaces, carried around in large motorized chairs and supping indeterminate slop from cups. Sounds like a great life. What we have here is a vision of control and communication much as Jean Baudrillard understood it, in which subjugation no longer takes the form of a subordination to an extrinsic spectacle, but rather invites us to interact and participate. It seems that the cinema audience is itself the object of this satire, which prompted some right-wing observers to recoil in disgust, condemning Disney Pixar for attacking its own audience. But this kind of irony feeds rather than challenges capitalist realism. A film like Wall-E exemplifies what Robert Fowler has called interpassivity. The film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. It's like fair trade. The role of capitalist ideology is not to make an explicit case for something in the way that propaganda does, but to conceal the fact that the operations of capital do not depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief. Which is like, me, an anti-capitalist, goes and pays money for products. Doesn't matter that I'm an anti-capitalist. My subjectively assumed beliefs don't come into it. It's impossible to conceive of fascism or Stalinism without propaganda, but capitalism can proceed perfectly well, in some ways better, without anyone making a case for it. Zizek's counsel... But people do make cases for it, dude, come on. Zizek's counsel here remains invaluable. If the concept of ideology is the classic one in which the illusion is located in knowledge, he argues, then today's society must appear post-ideological. The prevailing ideology is that of cynicism. People no longer believe in ideological truth. They do not take ideological propositions seriously. The fundamental level of ideology, however, is not of an illusion masking the real state of things, but that of an unconscious fantasy structuring our social reality itself. At this level, we are, of course, far from being a post-ideological society. Cynical distance is just one way to blind ourselves to the structural power of ideological fantasy. Even if we do not take things seriously, even if we keep an ironical distance, we're still doing them. Yeah, this is the fundamental point of ideology in Zizek, which is that even if we don't take things seriously, even if we keep an ironical distance, we're still doing them. Capitalist ideology in general, Zizek maintains, consists precisely in the overvaluing of belief, in the sense of inner subjective attitude, at the expense of the beliefs we exhibit and externalize in our behavior. So long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we're free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange. According to Zizek, capitalism in general relies on this structure of disavowal. I don't think Fishy is going to go into this because I don't think he's nearly as psychoanalytic as Zizek, but disavowal is a technical term here, which is the type of negation primarily utilized by the perverse subject structure. Hey, double penetration. Have you changed your name? I feel like it used to be different. What's going on? We're reading capitalist realism. Disavowal is the type of negation used by the perverse structure. Speaking of double penetration. Hey, Colonel Shameless. Very nice. Thank you so much for the sub. 3 months, that's delightful. And thank you, Double Perno, for, prompting it. Disavowal is the negation that takes the form, I know very well, and yet. And Zizek has these films. Actually, maybe I'll pop that on in the next break, because they're kind of good in little bits, called The Pervert's Guide to Cinema and The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. Anyway, it probably doesn't matter super much in this context, but anyway, disavowal equals perversion. Perversion is not a negative term, by the way. It's just like one of the 3 astrology symbols, horoscopes or whatever that Lacanian analysis believe in. I mean, mein Gott, we believe that money is only a meaningless token of no intrinsic worth, yet we act as if it has a holy value. Oh yeah? Why is that? Moreover, this behavior precisely depends upon the prior disavowal. We're able to fetishize money in our actions only because we've already taken an ironic distance towards money in our heads. Corporate anti-capitalism wouldn't matter if it could be differentiated from an authentic anti-capitalist movement. Yet, even before its momentum was stalled by the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center... The what? Sorry? Huh? The so-called anti-capitalist movement seemed to have conceded too much to capitalist realism. Its release date and publication somehow unclear. That's very funny. Date unknown, publisher unknown. Bada bing, bada boom. Since it was unable to posit a coherent alternative political economic model to capitalism, the suspicion was that the actual aim was not to replace capitalism, but to mitigate its worst excesses. Interesting. When's this? 2009. So has Occupy started yet? The Occupy movement, 2011. Okay, that makes sense. So it has not. Yeah. Which is interesting because that was kind of the first like really big mainstream modern Western like anti-capitalist movement that actually was anti-capitalist in a significant way, I think. Though we've kind of got some now, but XR or whatever, they're still pretty like, I don't know, they're not anti-capitalist very much. Yeah, F's in the chat for Occupy. Since it was unable to posit a coherent alternative political economic to capitalism, the suspicion was that the actual aim was not to replace capitalism, but to mitigate its worst excesses. And since the form of its activities tended to be the staging of protests rather than political organization, there was a sense that the anti-capitalist movement consisted of making a series of hysterical demands which it didn't expect to be met. I wonder if this is also hysterical in the technical Lacanian sense, not sure. Hysteria is the main type of neurosis. Projects have formed a kind of carnivalesque background noise to capitalist realism, and the anti-capitalist protests share rather too much with the hypercorporate events like 2005's Live 8, with their exorbitant demands that politicians legislate away poverty. Live 8 was a strange kind of protest, a protest that everyone could agree with. Who is it that actually wants poverty? And it's not that Live 8 was a degraded form of protest. On the contrary, it was in Live 8, I assume it's live, not live, I don't remember this whole thing, that the logic of the protest was revealed in its purest form. Yeah, that's true. Look, XR are a mixed bag, but I think, boomers who like drama is like not a bad shorthand. On the contrary, it was in Live 8 that the logic of the protest was revealed in its purest form. The protest impulse of the 60s posited a malevolent father, the harbinger of a reality principle, again, that's another Freudian term, that supposedly cruelly and arbitrarily denies the right to total enjoyment. The Lacan in here is coming thick and fast. I definitely didn't get any of this last time. Lacan was right, Hitzbone. Reality principle is a secondary part of the pleasure principle that identifies the ability to get more pleasure later by delaying pleasure now. So like the marshmallow test is like a really good example of the reality principle. And also a malevolent father. I mean, obviously that's very Freudian. And total enjoyment, that's a Lacanian thing. But I don't have time to ramble vaguely about it right now, because we've got like a whole page to read, and if I start, we won't stop for hours. This father has unlimited access to resources, but he selfishly and senselessly hoards them. Yet it's not capitalism, but protest itself, which depends upon this figuration of the father. The marshmallow test is primarily a measure of socioeconomic status of the child's family. Hilarious. I mean, sad, but hilarious. And one of the successes of the current global elite, several brackets, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm making fun of anti-Semites, I promise. YouTubers, don't be shit in the comments. Has been their avoidance of identification with the figure of the hoarding father, even though the reality they impose on the young is substantially harsher than the conditions they protested against in the 60s. So this is all that stuff like, well, back in my day, we had to blah, blah, blah. You know, kids these days don't want to work. Indeed, it was, of course, the global elite itself in the form of entertainers such as Richard Curtis and Bono, which organized the Live 8 event. I guess my new headcanon, that Richard Curtis and Bono were the two heads of the Illuminati. To reclaim a real... fuck yeah, dragons. It's cool as heck. To reclaim a political agency means, first of all, accepting our insertion at the level of desire in the remorseless meat grinder of capital. Interesting. What is being disavowed in the objection of evil and ignorance onto phantasmic others is our own complicity in planetary networks of oppression. What needs to be kept in mind is both that capitalism is a hyper-abstract impersonal structure, and it would be nothing without our cooperation. Okay, so I think this is fundamentally Mark Fisher's whole premise of this book. Right? Like, he's basically saying we need to stop disavowing our participation in capital and capitalism and the fact that we do want to buy Coke and that we do want cool Nike shoes and whatever else. It's funny, I use those two examples, but I don't really drink Coke and I definitely don't wear Nikes. But anyway, unless they're very cheap at Savers. And this is kind of a weirdly bland explanation of like his hope, right? Like, maybe we can actually do something if we can't, like, it'll stop feeling like capitalist realism, like we'll stop having this felt sense of like yeah, and I thank you for it, T Academic. If we can remember that our participation is actually having an impact, then we might be able to do something about it. What if we held a protest and everybody came? That's the title of the chapter. The most Gothic description of capital is also the most accurate. Capital is an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts into dead labor is ours, and the zombies it makes are us. There's a really cool guy called The Lit Crit Guy, and I think, yeah, Horror Vanguard is his podcast, but he also does... Oh, sorry, yeah, you can't see that. Gothic Marxism, this one, with Acid Horizon. It's a really good podcast, and I would strongly recommend it to everyone. It's quite fun, and I've dropped a link in there, and I'll leave it in the comments, in the description of the YouTube video. There is a sense in which it simply is the case that the political elite are our servants. The miserable service they provide from us is to launder our libidos, to obligingly represent for us our disavowed desires, as if they had nothing to do with us. Yeah, it's like Henry Kissinger, taking on all the evil of the United States foreign policy so that everyone else can drive gas guzzlers. The ideological blackmail that has been in place since the original Live Aid concerts in 1985 has insisted that caring individuals could end famine directly, without the need for any kind of political solution or systematic reorganization. It's necessary to act straight away, we were told. Politics has to be suspended in the name of ethical immediacy. Bono's product Red Brand... I don't know what that is. Bono's product Red Brand wanted to dispense even with the philanthropic intermediary. Philanthropy is like hippie music, holding hands, Bono proclaimed. Red is more like punk rock, hip-hop. This should feel like hard commerce. On the contrary, Product Red's punk rock or hip-hop character consisted in its realistic acceptance that capitalism is the only game in town. No, the aim was only to ensure that some of the proceeds of particular transactions went to good causes. The fantasy being that Western consumerism, far from being intrinsically implicated in systemic global inequalities, could itself solve them. All we have to do is buy the right products. And that is the end of chapter 2. Very cool. He's such a fun writer. I know I stopped to gush over some of his turns of phrase repeatedly, but it's just so good. If anyone dropped in late, this is what we're reading. Mark Fisher, Capitalist Realism. Is there no alternative? British academic who passed away a few years after writing this. Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that this book is good is that it's fun and it's short, and he makes references to Wally instead of random operas or whatever, and he's not writing in weird old-timey German that's been translated into French and then English like Engels or whatever. It's also super depressing, keeping in mind, as I've said, it feels like a suicide note at times. You thought Bono was insufferable, but fuck's sake, describing hard commerce as punk rock. Yeah. Don't you know conservatism is the new punk rock? Yeah, there's so much good stuff in this. I'll probably keep reading it, I think. I was thinking about continuing reading Engels today, but I didn't really enjoy it that much, so I think Mark Fisher is going to keep going. But yeah, I think this is his diagnosis and his prescription, right? The problem is capitalist realism, and the way out of the despair that brings is to remember that we do have agency and that capital does rely on us to participate, and that there are ways that we can not participate that are legitimately radical, whereas there are other ways that seem fun that are less legitimately radical, I guess, like Bono's business. All right, I'm going to call it there for the theory stuff. I'm going to switch over to Europa Universalis 4 in a minute. YouTubers, catch you next time. Everyone else, lovely to have you here. Stick around or not as you wish.